Everything people argue about on screens today started long before borders, before flags, before news footage and slogans. It began when a man stood under a sky so dense with stars it looked like spilled diamonds, and a promise settled over a patch of earth so small a camel could cross it in days, yet so charged with meaning that empires leaned in for millennia. The modern conflict did not invent these tensions. It inherited them, and the first layer is written in the Bible, in words so old they still echo when the wind rolls off the Judean hills. A man named Abram left Mesopotamia because he believed the God who called him was leading him to a land called Canaan. Genesis places it simply, "Go to the land that will be shown." That land runs like a bridge between Africa and Asia, between seas and deserts. Armies marched it because it was narrow. Faiths planted altars because it felt chosen. Abram became Abraham, his wife Sarah, and her maid Hagar, his sons Isaac and Ishmael. Each carried pieces of the promise, and here is where the roots go deep. Jewish memory traces its covenant promise through Isaac and Jacob, whose name becomes Israel. Arab memory, especially among many tribes, honors Ishmael as an ancestor through whom God also promised to multiply. That memory matters. It shaped the way two great family stories both see the same hills as home. Before a flag there was a famine and a journey. Jacob's sons went to Egypt. Their descendants returned in the Exodus, not as nomads, but as a people shaped by commandments. The Bible's picture is blunt. Canaan was not an empty stage. It had cities, kings, alliances, and the mysterious Philistines who came by sea and settled the coastal plain. The Israelites under Joshua crossed the Jordan, fought for footholds, and slowly, unevenly, took root. Judges ruled loosely. Then Saul fought the Philistines. David united tribes, and Solomon built a temple so dazzling every stone told the story. This place is holy. That temple tied land and worship together, and that bond has pulled hearts toward Jerusalem ever since. The Bible never presents land as a blank check. It frames it as a trust. The prophets thundered that the land spits out injustice like a body rejects poison. Laws included protections for resident foreigners, debt relief, and leaving fields fallow so the land could breathe. Leviticus calls the land God's, not anyone else's. Israel's hold was conditional, and the prophets said exile would come if the people ignored justice. That warning was not decorative. Solomon died and the kingdom split. Israel in the north, Judah in the south, capital in Jerusalem. Assyria crushed the north in 722 BCE and scattered its leadership. Babylon took Jerusalem in 586 BCE, tore down the temple, and dragged elites into exile. By the rivers of Babylon, Psalms of Zion were whispered like contraband. This was the moment a people learned to carry a homeland in prayer. When the home was stone and ash, exile did not erase the hope of return. It intensified it. That hope persisted because of another detail history confirms. Empires rise, and then they release. Persia rolled in, and Cyrus allowed exiles to return in 538 BCE. The Second Temple rose, less glorious than Solomon's, but charged with survival. The province was now called Yehud in Persian records. Priests and governors tried to rebuild walls and law. The population mixed, Judeans who stayed through exile, returnees from Babylon, and communities like the Samaritans who claimed ancient Israelite roots but clashed with Jerusalem's leadership. The land did not belong to one memory. It already held many. Greek footsteps followed Persian ones. Alexander arrived in 332 BCE, and everything changed again. Greek cities, Greek speech, Greek culture pressed into a land where Jews argued over how much of it to accept. It was not just a taste for theater or new coins. It was a battle for identity. Seleucid rulers took control, and Antiochus IV went too far by profaning the temple. The response was the Maccabean Revolt, around 167 BCE, a rare moment when Judean fighters actually won. A Jewish kingdom returned under the Hasmoneans, territorial for a time, even forcibly converting some neighbors like the Idumeans. That detail sits awkwardly but cannot be skipped. It taught later generations that power can twist even sacred memory. Rome arrived because internal fights invited it. In 63 BCE, Pompey marched in, looked into the Holy of Holies, and Jerusalem fell under Roman orbit. The great and Idumean by family, Jewish by religion, rebuilt the temple magnificently and turned Jerusalem into a stone declaration of glory. Yet Roman rule included heavy taxes and humiliation. New sects formed: Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, Zealots, each with a different answer. In this period, the Gospels situate the life of Jesus of Nazareth, who taught in Galilee and Jerusalem under Roman governance. First-century Judea was a powder keg. Josephus, a Jewish historian who lived through it, tells how revolt exploded in 66 CE and how Roman legions crushed it. In 70 CE, the temple burned. Stones tumbled like teeth knocked out of a jaw. In 135 CE, a final revolt under Simon Bar Kokhba erupted, and Rome broke it with finality. Emperor Hadrian rebuilt Jerusalem as Aelia Capitolina, barred Jews from the city for a time, and changed the province's name to Syria Palestina. The name was not invented from thin air. Greeks like Herodotus had spoken of Palestine, Syria centuries earlier in reference to the coastal area. Rome used it to sever the association with Judea. It was a message pressed into maps. Forget the old names. Names never fully disappear. Jewish prayer fixed on Jerusalem 3 times daily. Pilgrims returned when they could. Rabbinic teachings developed in Galilee and in Babylon, and coins from the Bar Kokhba revolt, stamped year 1 of the redemption of Israel, kept the memory of sovereignty alive. Meanwhile, Christian communities grew rapidly, and by the 4th century, Roman emperors favored Christianity. Jerusalem, now under Christian rulers, swelled with churches and pilgrims. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre rose over the site venerated as the place of Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection. Jewish access ebbed and flowed depending on the emperor and local policy. Samaritans rebelled and were crushed. The land's identity did not sit still, it layered. The 7th century opened a new chapter. The Sassanid Persians took Jerusalem in 614. Then the Byzantines took it back. And then, in 638, Arab armies under Caliph Umar entered the city. In early Muslim memory, Jerusalem became Al-Quds, the holy, and a place connected to the Prophet's night journey. The Dome of the Rock was built in 690 and 690 under Umayyad Caliph Abd al-Malik on the Temple Mount Haram al-Sharif, with mosaics that still blaze like sunrise when light strikes them. The Al-Aqsa Mosque rose soon after. Under Islamic rule, Jews and Christians were recognized as people of the book, often allowed to live and worship as protected communities with a special tax. Some periods were harsh. Others allowed a measured coexistence. Arabic language and culture spread, not by instant erasure but by centuries of adoption. Local populations shifted, married, and adapted. The land called Palestine in Arabic geographies kept absorbing names, families, and prayers. Crusaders burst onto the scene in 1999 with a storm of iron and vows. When they took Jerusalem, medieval chronicles recorded horrors that froze the blood. A Latin kingdom rose, planting castles like teeth across ridges, while Eastern Christian, Jewish, and Muslim communities learned to survive or fled. In 1187, Salah ad-Din Saladin took Jerusalem back after the Battle of Hattin, negotiating a more measured restitution and allowing many residents to ransom their freedom. The city changed hands more times. Brief treaties, broken truces, raids, and recoveries. In 1244, Khwarezmian forces sacked the city again. The Mamluks rose from slave soldier ranks to rulers and stabilized the region from the 13th to the early 16th century, rebuilding roads, fountains, and schools. Jewish communities dotted the land: Jerusalem, Hebron, Safed, Tiberias, sometimes small, sometimes growing, always tethered to sacred texts and tombs. The Ottoman Empire swept in by 15177. For 4 centuries the land was an Ottoman district under governors in Damascus, or sometimes in Jerusalem itself. Ottoman registers from the 1500s list villages by name, crops by type, grain, olives, grapes, laundry hung like flags between stone courtyards, and the rhythm of prayer marked dawn and dusk. In the 1500s and 1600s, Sephardic Jews expelled from Spain and Portugal rebuilt scholarly life in Safed, where mystics like Isaac Luria taught that the world needed healing and that human acts could repair it. Their hymns still rise on Friday nights. Arabic-speaking peasants tended terraces built generations earlier. Bedouin tribes migrated seasonally. Christians worshipped in churches old enough to make hands tremble. The land breathed many tongues and loyalties. Ottoman reforms in the 1800s changed taxes, armies, and land ownership. Egypt briefly took the region under Muhammad Ali and his son Ibrahim Pasha in the 1830s. A major Palestinian Arab revolt in 1834 pushed back against conscription and rule. Europeans arrived in growing numbers: missionaries, scholars, tourists with sketchbooks, consuls with agendas. Travelogues described Palestine as a place of ruins and gardens, famine, and fertility, rarely neutral and often romanticized. The word Palestine appeared in Arabic newspapers and letters. In the late 19th century, nationalism swelled across Europe and the Middle East. Identities sharpened. This is when the modern roots begin to curl tight around ancient stones. Another movement started far away in Europe's ghettos and salons. The Jewish Enlightenment loosened old bonds, and pogroms in Russia lit fear that could not be ignored. Writers like Leon Pinsker argued that emancipation without security was an illusion. Theodor Herzl convened the first Zionist Congress in 1997 in Basel, arguing for a publicly recognized homeland for the Jewish people in the land their prayers had never left. Some Zionists spoke of Uganda or Argentina as temporary refuges, but the magnet kept pulling to Zion, not because of climate or crops, but because of covenant and memory. Early Zionist immigrants arrived in waves called Aliyah. The first Aliyah began around 1882. Farmers buying land often legally, often from absentee landlords in Beirut or Cairo, building villages like Rishon LeZion and Petah Tikva. Later waves added kibbutzim, collective farms with shared ownership. The Ottoman land code made registration complex, and purchases sometimes displaced local tenant farmers who had tilled fields for generations. This fact created anger and fear among Arab peasants and notable families. Meanwhile, Arabic newspapers debated identity, Ottoman loyalty, and the meaning of Palestine. Local leadership ranged from Christian Arab journalists in Jerusalem to Muslim notables with deep clan influence. World wars redrew everything. British diplomats promised Arab independence against the Ottomans in the Hussein McMahon correspondence, while simultaneously drafting Sykes-Picot to slice Ottoman provinces into British and French zones. In 1917, Arthur Balfour issued a letter promising a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, while safeguarding the rights of existing non-Jewish communities. British troops entered Jerusalem in December 1917 as the Ottoman order collapsed. After the war, the League of Nations granted Britain the mandate for Palestine in 1922. The mandate's text embedded the Balfour Declaration and recognized the historical connection of the Jewish people to the land. It also confirmed existing communities' civil and religious rights. Two visions were now pinned to one small map. Demographics were not frozen. Jewish immigration grew from tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands by the 1930s, driven by European anti-Semitism, legal opportunities, and the Zionist project's magnetism. Arab communities were not passive. They organized politically, unionized farmers and workers, and wrote manifestos. Violence flared. 1,920 in Jerusalem, 1,921 in Jaffa, and in 1,000 Jews were killed, and the ancient community emptied. British commissions investigated, wrote reports, and produced white papers that tried to adjust policy. The Passfield White Paper of 1930 angered Zionists. Arab leaders rejected partition plans that seemed to divide ancestral villages. The Jewish Agency negotiated with London. The Arab Higher Committee boycotted or demanded halts to Jewish immigration. The 1936-1939 Arab Revolt shook the mandate to its core. It began as a general strike and escalated into guerrilla warfare against British forces and the Zionist project. The British response was brutal and methodical. Collective punishments, curfews, fortified police stations. The Peel Commission in 1937 proposed partition 2 states with population transfers. It admitted that one mandate could not satisfy 2 national movements. Zionist leadership accepted the idea in principle. Arab leadership rejected it, arguing it violated rights of the majority and the integrity of the land. Britain issued the 1939 White Paper, severely limiting Jewish immigration, just as Europe became a furnace. That paper promised an independent Palestine within 10 years, with Arab and Jewish partnership, but capped Jewish immigration at 75,000 over 5 years, after which the Arab majority would have to consent to further immigration. The promise came too late and saved too few. Then Europe erupted. The Holocaust annihilated 6 million Jews, ripping out families, scholarship, childhoods, and entire villages. Survivors drifted to displaced persons camps, many looking toward Palestine, not as an abstract homeland, but as the last door still open. Illegal immigration ships, like the Exodus, tried to break British quotas. Those ships were turned back. Survivors were put in camps. The moral force of human catastrophe collided with the political reality on the ground. The British mandate cracked. The United Nations took up the issue. In 19947, UNS COP toured the land, saw refugee camps, met delegations, and recommended partition. On November 29, 1947, the General Assembly passed Resolution 181, 2 states, and international Jerusalem. The vote tally, 33 in favor, 13 against, 10 abstentions made headlines that still echo. Jewish communities celebrated and prepared for war. Arab leaders across the region and in Palestine rejected the plan as unjust. Violence broke into the open immediately. The civil war phase of the conflict had begun even before the British exited. Battles erupted over roads, neighborhoods, and supply lines. The Haganah became a competent army. Smaller groups like Irgun and Lehi pursued their own tactics, sometimes brutal. On April 9, 1948, the attack on Deir Yassin by Irgun and Lehi forces killed over 100 villagers. Fear raced across the hills. Arab irregulars and local units blocked roads like the one to Jerusalem, starved out isolated settlements, and clashed repeatedly. Plan Dalei, a Haganah operational plan for securing the territory of the proposed Jewish state and main roads, unfolded amid chaos. Some Arab communities fled under orders or because of combat. Others were expelled by Israeli units. The story of why people left varies by village and source, but the outcome is not disputed. Around 700,000 Palestinian Arabs became refugees, a catastrophe remembered as the Nakba dispossession, loss, exile. Jewish towns like the ancient community in the Jewish quarter of the Old City surrendered. Entire populations were expelled by Arab forces as well. The ledger of suffering grew on all sides. On May 14, 1948, David Ben-Gurion declared the independence of the State of Israel as the British left. The next day, armies from Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq crossed in. The war expanded. The Jordanian Arab Legion, trained and led by British officers, took East Jerusalem, including the Old City and the Western Wall, and held the West Bank. Israel survived and expanded beyond the UN-proposed borders. Ceasefires in 1949 fixed armistice lines, what would become known as the Green Line, but not peace. Gaza was placed under Egyptian administration. The West Bank was annexed by Jordan in 1900. The refugee camps became cities of canvas and tin. UNRWA was born to support them. Meanwhile, Jewish refugees flowed the other direction. In the years after 1948, roughly 800,000 Jews left or were expelled from Arab countries, many resettling in Israel. Sporadic conflicts pounded the region. In 1956, Israel, Britain, and France attacked Egypt after Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal. International pressure forced a withdrawal, but the lesson stuck. Wars redrew realities even when papers said otherwise. In June 1967, after months of tension, Israel struck preemptively against Egypt and, in 6 dizzying days, took Sinai, Gaza, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights. Paratroopers stood before the Western Wall in tears. The Temple Mount came under Israeli control, but Israeli leaders left Muslim religious authorities in charge of the compound's internal management. Another round of displacement followed. The map again refused to sit still. The United Nations passed Resolution 242 calling for withdrawal from territories occupied in the conflict, and the right of every state in the area to live in peace, phrasing that would underwrite decades of negotiation and argument. The 1973 Yom Kippur War shattered complacency. Egypt and Syria attacked on Judaism's holiest day. Early gains gave way to an Israeli counteroffensive, and diplomacy stepped in to halt disaster. Out of that trauma came the first Arab-Israeli peace treaty. Egypt and Israel signed peace in 1979. Israel returned Sinai, and a cold but durable peace took root. Jordan made peace with Israel in 1994. The Palestinian question, however, remained the unresolved core. Palestinian nationalism had emerged clearly in the mid-20th century, crystallizing in the Palestine Liberation Organization founded in 1964. Its charter initially rejected Israel's legitimacy. Decades later, it would recognize Israel's right to exist. In 1987, the First Intifada erupted boycotts, stones, strikes, graffiti, and leaflets, as well as shootings and other violence, an uprising rooted in occupation fatigue and political paralysis. Images of youths facing soldiers poured into global consciousness. The struggle pulled the world's attention back to daily life. Under checkpoints and settlements, the push and pull of security and control. The Oslo Accords in 1993 and 1995 created the Palestinian Authority and set up a gradual path toward a final status that never arrived. Israeli settlers had been building communities in the West Bank and Gaza since the late 1960s. Their population grew. Oslo's map sliced the West Bank into areas A, B, and C, with varying control. Each side accused the other of violating promises. In 2000, negotiations failed at Camp David. The Second Intifada broke out after a visit by Ariel Sharon to the Temple Mount/Haram al-Sharif, and the shattering of expectations. Violence escalated: suicide bombings, assassinations, invasions of cities, the building of a separation barrier. Trauma stacked upon trauma. In 2005, Israel unilaterally withdrew from Gaza, evacuating settlements and pulling out soldiers. In 2006, Hamas won legislative elections. In 2007, it took power in Gaza after a brief civil conflict with Fatah. Periodic wars between Israel and Hamas in 2008, 2009, 2012, 2014, and later years killed thousands and broke neighborhoods into rubble and grief. Rockets and airstrikes turned skies into warning. The West Bank remained under a complex system of Palestinian self-rule in cities and Israeli control in much of the territory. Jerusalem unreconciled, burning inside its stones, remained the city that could never be shared without each side feeling it had compromised its soul. This looks like a modern nightmare born in the 20th century, yet the oldest lines still hum beneath it. A covenant and a temple, a journey and an exile, a people carrying a map in their prayers, and another people woven into the orchards and olive-packed hills over centuries. The conflict began when stories about land became stories about identity, bound to commands, martyrs, songs, and graves. The political scene is a surface of ruins and negotiation. The bedrock runs down into Abraham and the prophets, empire and memory, names changed by conquerors and names whispered back in families who refuse to forget. Even the word Palestine carries multiple stamps. Greek writers like Herodotus used Palestine, Syria, for the coastal strip and adjacent areas centuries before the Romans, likely referencing the Philistines whose name echoes in the term. In the Roman period, Syria Palestina renamed the larger province. Late antique and medieval Christian writers used Palestine as a familiar geography. Arabic geographers spoke of Jund Philastin, a military district in the early Islamic period. Ottoman administrators did not use Palestine as a formal province name. They recorded sanjaks and vilayets. 19th century travelers popularized it anew. By the early 20th century, Palestinian described both Jews and Arabs, living in the mandate newspapers like the Palestine Post, now the Jerusalem Post, bore the name. After 1948, Palestinian primarily identified Arab people from Palestine, solidifying as a national identity through dispossession and political organization. The word itself shows how names evolve and claim meaning through use and suffering. This is where the biblical roots are often misread. The Bible's story of the land is not a justification memo for modern policies. It is a narrative of vocation, trial, justice, and mercy. It claims that land without righteousness becomes exile. It frames a home as a place for the widow, the orphan, and the stranger to find protection. Prophets like Jeremiah and Isaiah taught that ritual without justice makes temples emptier than ruins. Jewish tradition kept these texts at the center, wrestling with the meaning of return and righteousness across centuries. Christian tradition read the promises through the lens of Jesus and the Church, sometimes severing Israel from its land, sometimes supporting Jewish return, and at other times fomenting anti-Semitism that led to expulsions and crusades. Islamic tradition honored the land through Quranic memory of prophets and the sanctity of Al-Aqsa, embedding Jerusalem as a station of heaven's touch. None of this can be untangled without understanding how stories become borders and how prayers become policies. Archaeology adds another layer. Shards, seals, and inscriptions confirm ancient names: Bethlehem on a Byzantine seal, Yehud on Persian-era coins, Pontius Pilate on a stone from Caesarea, House of David on the Tel Dan stele. Caves near Qumran kept the Dead Sea Scrolls intact for 2,000 years, preserving Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek texts that show a Jewish world in ferment before and during the time of Jesus. The City of David yields tunnels and inscription. Philistine pottery and DNA studies show origins linked to Aegean migration centuries earlier than the Roman name change. Archaeology does not pick sides. It testifies to deep time and layered population. People have walked here with purpose for as long as records exist. Modern national circles often simplify to survive. Zionism emerged as a national liberation movement for a people hounded from Europe and the Muslim world. Palestinian nationalism emerged as a response to colonial boundaries and a necessity to preserve a people rooted in cities like Jaffa and villages like Deir Yassin, in family trees branching under olive groves. Each side's anthem sings tragedy. Each side's calendar keeps days of mourning and celebration. Children grow up with maps drawn in school that tell different stories about the same valleys. The idea of home has been shaped by exile for both peoples. Jews built a portable homeland through Torah, Hebrew prayer, and a calendar that kept memory alive in exile. Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews clung to traditions forged under Islam. Ashkenazi Jews shaped theirs in Europe's bitter winters, and all gathered strands of memory into a return that began as a whisper and became policy. Palestinians built resilience under foreign administrators, through Ottoman, British, Jordanian, and Egyptian rule, through dispossession in 1948 and occupation after 1967. Refugee camps became cities with their own schools, clinics, poetry, and politics. The right of return became a phrase heavier than stone. The argument over return, compensation, and recognition sits like an unlit fuse beneath negotiations. Jerusalem embodies the impossibility. For Jews, it is the city of David, the axis of prayer, the ruined and rebuilt walls that anchor an entire people's longing. For Christians, it is the place where God entered suffering, where resurrection remade hope. For Muslims, it is the site of the night journey, the first Qibla, the Haram's domes, shining like crowns. No other place marries heaven and earth so tightly for so many. Backs on the ground hardened, neighborhoods purchased or seized, homes demolished or preserved, archaeology argued over as proof or provocation, holy days stacked like wood, even quiet days feel like a held breath. International law tried to draw lines through texts like 242 and 338, through Geneva Conventions and advisory opinions. Peace plans multiplied Oslo, Wye River, Camp David, Annapolis, Arab Peace Initiative, each proposing land swaps, shared capitals, refugee solutions, security arrangements. Each runs into fear, politics, militias, settlers, terrorists, spoilers, and leaders weighed down by history. Maps show areas A, B, C, and the Gaza envelope. The human heart sees grandparents' graves, a school commute, a bus route that used to be safe and is not, a gate that opened once and now locks every night at sunset. The biblical story adds a surprise often left out of political speeches. It tells Israel to remember that it was once a stranger in a foreign land and to treat the stranger as native. It commands fields to be left for the poor and the sojourner. It declares a jubilee where debts are released and property returns to original families. These ideas sound unworkable in modern states, yet they reveal the moral atmosphere the text expects. The land is never only soil, it is a test. When either people tries to secure blessing without justice, the text warns of exile, and exile returns like a shadow. Even controversies over nomenclature are rehearsals of memory. Judea and Samaria to one, the West Bank to another. 1948 War of Independence in one textbook, the Nakba in another. Words become border posts. Where a person starts the story, shapes where it ends. Beginning in Genesis yields a line of covenant and exile. Beginning in 638 places, Arab and Islamic memory at the center. Beginning in 1517 highlights, Ottoman centuries of shared life. Beginning in 1897 highlights, nationalism's modern turn. Beginning in 1977 or 9047 centers international commitments and betrayals. Each starting line tries to own the beginning. Each is true and insufficient alone. This is not an invitation to choose a winner or pronounce an easy origin. It is a call to see how the conflict began as a competition between sacred stories that neither side can abandon. The Bible is not a museum piece. It is a living text that formed a people who returned with their language and liturgy intact. Palestinian identity is not a footnote. It is a nation shaped by centuries of belonging to the same hills, markets, and shrines. Empires came and left stamps, but the local heartbeat never stopped. The memory of Sarajevo's guns in the 20th century proved that histories can ignite quickly when identities overlap. The memory of ancient prophets shows that justice is not optional. This land announces that both lessons apply. Children grow in the layers. A Jewish child in Jerusalem learns that the Western Wall is the last visible remnant of the Second Temple's retaining structure, a touchstone through which ancestors passed, longing from mouth to mouth. A Palestinian child in the same city learns that her grandmother's house key opens a door that no longer exists, but still holds a room inside the mind, and that her family's graves under the cypress trees are not negotiable. Each child's truth can harden into rejection. Each can also become a bridge. The Bible's threads are not neutral, but they are honest. They reveal a beginning rooted in promise that carries responsibility, and a land treated as holy by more than one people. The origins are older than the British Mandate and younger than Abraham. They sit at the crossroads of diaspora and domicile, of law and longing. The beginning is present whenever a psalm is whispered at the wall, whenever a call to prayer blankets the old city, whenever incense swings in the church of the Holy Sepulchre and a pilgrim weeps. The beginning lives in ancient treaties, in Roman decrees that tried to erase names, in Mamluk walk deeds appointing caretakers, in Ottoman tax lists, in British memoranda, in UN resolutions. The beginning lives in the first time a family told a child, "This is our home," and the ground knows our name. Biblical accuracy matters because it calibrates expectation. The text sets sacred obligations beneath any claim to land. The Psalms vow not to forget Jerusalem. The prophets demand a city where widows receive justice at the gate. The land was not promised as a trophy, but entrusted as a place to demonstrate God's character in public. That stewardship includes care for the resident alien. The biblical narrative recognizes Ishmael's destiny and blessing, even while the covenant line runs through Isaac. That nuance often disappears in polemic and reappears in prayer. It indicates that God's care is not scarce. The land's holiness is not a license for cruelty, but a rebuke against it. History adds another calibration. It records that populations in the land have always mixed. A Bronze Age village becomes a Roman garrison, an Arab market, an Ottoman police station, a British office, an Israeli museum, a Palestinian apartment block. Ancestry's knot. Genetic studies show continuity and change. Identities become less about pure blood and more about adopted story. The point is not to dissolve claims, but to anchor them in patience. The beginning was layered. The solution, if it can exist, requires acknowledgement that neither story will be exiled again. Pilgrims today stand in line to enter the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, then walk out and hear the muezzin's call, then turn and see men swaying at the Western Wall. In one block, three faiths lean on the same stone. The Talmud says Jerusalem makes the world connected. Local proverbs say, "The land teaches humility." A taxi driver points at a hill and says his grandfather planted olives there in 1910. A rabbi lifts a child to kiss a mezuzah and says their people have always come home to this doorway. These are not theoretical statements. They are daily, physical, and inherited. The conflict's beginning can be traced to the moment land was tied to holiness, when identity could not be loosened from stones without tearing a soul. The Bible does this. The Quran and the Christian Gospels add their own chords. Empires try to break the knot. It tightened. Modern nationalism translated sacred longing into political movements with armies and flags. Colonial policy added promises that collided like trains. Refugees created facts of suffering that demand redress. Memory made compromise feel like betrayal. Here, the biblical dimension does not offer policy prescriptions. It offers a frame. The land belongs to God, not to any one of its tenants. The people who claim it are asked to live differently on it. That demand is in the DNA of the story. Without justice, the land becomes hostage to cycles that look like ancient judgments reimagined. With justice, the land's vocation becomes visible. A place where nations learn mercy. A city where adversaries sit together at gates that breathe easy. The prophet's visions sound utopian until a person remembers how often history already turned impossible pages. Exiles returning, empires dissolving, a language reborn on the street after 2,000 years. The first flame of the conflict flickered when Abraham's footsteps met the Canaanite road. It blazed when altars became temples and temples became ruins. It smoldered in prayers that carried maps while the people carrying them lived in exile. It sparked again when a modern movement put those prayers into deeds. And another people, already at home in those hills, felt themselves pushed toward the edge. It is not a single beginning but a series of beginnings, all converging on the same narrow stage, all convinced that God, history, or both have written their names into the deed. Recognizing that complexity is not surrender to confusion. It is an act of respect for reality. The story started as a set of sacred claims and responsibilities. History added migrations, conversions, administrations, and attachments. The modern world stamped it with law, borders, and diplomacy. The core, however, remains theological as much as political. That is why proposed solutions shiver when they reach Jerusalem's stones. That is why names such as Judah, Israel, Palestine, Zion, Al-Quds cannot be erased by decrees. They are engraved not only on maps but on souls, as long as people insist that their story alone owns the land. The beginning keeps repeating itself like a loop. When memory hears its neighbor's memory and refuses to consider it a threat, the beginning can become a chapter and not the whole book. The deep Bible stories were never meant to end with swords drawn. They were meant to challenge rulers, comfort the broken, and make communities into places where migrants, widows, and orphans do not fear the gate. The conflict began when people forgot that the land is a trust, not a trophy. The pages still turn, and the oldest sentences still wait to be heard as they were written, as calls to live a life that makes a home worthy of the name holy.